if you think about who's winning from the housing crisis and who isn't, it's obviously the landlords. They are doing extremely well. They claim that they're very concerned about this and that we need to solve the housing crisis. But you can just watch the wealth transfer happen. You can watch, £60 billion every year being spent on rent, a third of which comes directly from the government. That's a completely unsustainable state of affairs because everyone who's paying that rent is really suffering, and everyone who it's being paid to is doing extremely well. That can't continue. That shouldn't continue on moral or economic or political grounds. It's just the worst way of doing things. It's the most expensive way of being accommodated. It's often the worst quality way of being accommodated. Every form of being accommodated, owner occupation, social housing, or some sort of cooperative living, is better than a system of private rent extraction. The amount of money that central and local governments spend on landlords is just unbelievable, and it seems to have crept up slowly. That it started off as a drip and is now a rush, and it's the one tap that the state never seems to have turned off. As it's defunded everything else, it's massively opened the channels of housing benefit and propped up this system that keeps people in miserable conditions, in very febrile and precarious living situations, and completely unable to exit the system that exploits them every day, that sees 40, 50, 60% of their income given over to somebody who does nothing. The number of landlords in Britain is sensational. It started from a very, very low point in the 70s when landlordism nearly collapsed, to the situation today when 1 in every 21 adults declares an income from landlordism. So there's this amazing kind of social closeness that they're absolutely everywhere. There's 4 times as many of them as teachers. There's twice as many of them as NHS England workers. It's Britain's boom industry. So 50 years ago we nearly abolished landlords, and I think it's really interesting and surprising how easy it is and how necessary it is to regulate them out of existence. All you need is the economic headwinds against them, and their profits disappear, and they start to have to sell up. And when they have to sell up, everybody benefits. The state spends less money, there are more homeowners, there's more capacity for social housing. So we came tantalisingly close, just through things like rent controls, just through things like regulating the way in which tenancies worked, to driving this business into the grounds, to eliminating it entirely. And we could easily do it again if we wanted to. Most economists, and in most places in the world, argue that housing gets more expensive as it becomes higher quality. What we have in Britain is this weird phenomenon that it's getting more expensive to run away pace while everything gets worse. And that's not just a case of everyone wanting to live in London because London's great. London is really suffering. Its public services are being dismantled, its amenities are crumbling. So we can't rely on this idea that London is this fantastic emerald city and that's why housing is so expensive here. It's getting more expensive even as the city itself declines. So we need to think about better explanations for the housing crisis than, well, we're all richer now and we want nicer homes and that's why they're becoming more expensive. That's nonsense. We need to think about what it is in the first place that makes housing valuable, and ultimately that boils down to rent. Rents go up if left to their own devices. Most governments know this, and most governments do the sensible thing of stopping that. Our government decided 20, 30 years ago that it didn't want to. It wanted to let rents go up as much as they possibly could. The current housing system is the consequence of the abolition of rent controls in the 80s. No one would begin to argue that it's a good system. Everybody hates it, but for some reason people get very upset when we talk about restoring rent controls. They were won amazingly quickly. They were won within a matter of weeks. In a moment of kind of working class struggle in Glasgow during the First World War. They were implemented as an emergency measure, but they remained in place for the best part of 100 years. Again, if we had the political will, it wouldn't be difficult to implement rent controls. We see Scotland doing it now. And I think when people talk about problems with rent controls, you know, we can troubleshoot those. That's not an argument about rent controls generally. If rent controls didn't work, they would have been abolished in every country in the world. Instead, they've only really been abolished in Britain. Let's start with something and let's make it better if we need to. Let's start with something and see if it works. But any form of rent control, anything that removed the horror of lingering evictions and removed the horror of 50% of people's incomes going to landlords, would be better than what we have now. Most places in Europe do renting better than Britain. And what's really interesting is that while the ideas that we're talking about are Marxist ideas, they're also ideas that dominate the narrative in most other sensible places in the world. What is kind of castigated here as an extremist proposal is just the fundamental basis of the landlord-tenant relationship in most sensible countries in Europe. So we shouldn't be ashamed or afraid of talking about things like rent control and indefinite tenancies. When we float these ideas here, the landlord lobby goes wild and says this is going to be a catastrophe. Of course, it's the system that works almost everywhere else in the world. It didn't start off like this. It started off with the gentle loosening up of tenancies, the gentle loosening up of rent controls, and no one set out to create the hell that we live in now. But landlords have come to find it very convenient, homeowners have come to find it very convenient, and those two groups are kind of politically allied to one another. They form a massive part of our political class, but also of our social class. I mean, there are still more homeowners in Britain than any other type of tenure. So it's kind of landlordism and its role in home ownership plays this dangerously prominent role in how Britain's housing economy works. So I think it isn't the case that there was a mad and a kind of malicious intent to destroy rent controls. It was a system that happened over time, but people in power have found it works for them. Everything is a housing problem when you get down to it. One of the original policy intentions behind creating the housing crisis was labour mobility. The Thatcher government wanted people not stuck in secure housing, stuck as she would put it, but able to go as and where businesses needed them. That's all very well and good. People are now very precarious, and that's wonderful if you're an employer. But your wage bill is staggering, because untrammelled rents means you've got to pay your workers an ungodly amount just to keep them housed. So she's won in one sense, good for British business, but in another, the amount that the state has to pay and the amount that employers have to pay really does boil down to housing as being the horror of the present day. Well, when it comes to housing, I think the Labour Party is past praying for. If you look at the debates that are happening elsewhere, in Germany, in Berlin, the big debate was whether they should make rent controls stronger. In Scotland, the debate is exactly how rent control should be implemented. Local Labour mayors are saying we desperately want rent controls. Keir Starmer isn't saying anything at all. Keir Starmer is happy to let those who are calling for rent controls take the flak and be derided as having this outrageous demand. He seems to have no interest in doing the one thing that really needs to be done to bring the housing crisis to an end. If you're thinking about becoming a landlord, if you are a landlord, I would say look at the people who are suffering and look at the extent to which they're suffering. Look at how much of the private rented sector is not just in a bad condition but a hazardous condition. Look at how much rent, look at how much money is being transferred from the class of renters to the class of landlords and the resulting poverty. Look at the system of precarity that means kids don't know where they're going to be living in a few months' time, the interruption to their education, the interruption to people's mental health, the constant worry about where, how, and whether you're going to find somewhere to live. If you really want to participate in that system, I think you need to have a strong word with yourself. I'm really disappointed to see people on social media celebrating landlordism, particularly the worst forms of landlordism, like converting properties into HMOs. You really are working at the human misery factory if what you're doing is creating an environment in which you can extract as much money as you can from people's desperate need. That's a horrible state of affairs. I think anyone who is engaged in that should feel a deep sense of shame. They probably see themselves as someone who is providing housing, but they're not. They're withholding it until they can get rich off it. And that's a horrible, horrible system. This has happened in the past, particularly when we've had scandals in the private rented sector in England and Wales, where institutional landlords like the church decided to sell off most of its housing because it was ashamed of the kind of moral stigma attached to being a landlord. We need to rediscover that sense of shame. We need to make sure that we're not celebrating a system in which people live very, very precarious lives and pay an unbelievable amount of money for the benefit. In landlord abolition, it's a lot like abolishing the police. We don't just go around and hand every copper a letter of dismissal. We create a system in which landlords aren't necessary. We create a system in which landlordism isn't possible. You know, the classic kind of example of the accidental landlord. Let's say I own a home and I get a job abroad or in a different city, and I think, well, maybe I'll let it out and I'll be fine. I'll be a nice landlord. What we should be doing is working towards a system in which that shouldn't be necessary or possible, working towards a system in which home ownership is easily achievable for anyone who wants it, in which buying and selling homes can happen as and when the need arises, rather than being this overwhelming financial decision. This is a daft way of doing things. This is a stupid way of doing things. We should have the homes that we need as and when we need them, and that's a very, very achievable state of affairs. I don't think landlords see the harm they're doing. I think they're quite good at deluding themselves into thinking that their tenant, who is paying half of their income to the landlord for doing nothing, is perfectly happy. And often they can convince themselves of that by persuading themselves that someone else would do it worse. Maybe that's true, but they're still doing a bad thing. I kind of understand why people do it. It's free money, and it's free money that's sanctioned by the government and the law. You'd be mad not to. And that's why it's important not to be moralistic about landlordism, and instead attack the structures that enable it to happen. It's all very well and good going around screaming at people, you're a landlord and that's horrible, but why would you not take free money? Why would you not take money that the state underwrites and guarantees? So the focus has got to be on implementing the policies that make landlordism unrealistic, rather than screaming at people for doing something that the state really, really encourages them to do, particularly in a society where we've got terrible, terrible wage constraint, poor job prospects, public services are being shattered. Landlordism makes absolute sense from an economic point of view. It's just the moral and social one in which it's so harmful. Marx tends to look at everything through a question of why is there so much poverty in a world of plenty? That's very, very different from the narrative we normally get about housing. Homes are unique as commodities. They're not the same as anything else that you buy, and anyone who tries to convince you that a home is like a chair is just wrong. Homes are absolutely essential for everyone. They are alienable in that landlords can take them away from us, and they are non-reproducible. So if I'm living in a flat and a landlord says, I'd like a bit of his money, he can't just put up a new flat next door and say, why don't you come on over and live in my flat? That's not how the property market works. That's not how homes work. So instead, landlords don't undercut each other in that usual kind of market clearing way. What they do as a class is they tend to withhold rent until the price they want can be realised. Marx argues this is a monopoly price. This is the maximum amount that tenants can pay at a particular location under given social circumstances without dying effectively. So when you don't have rent controls, prices tend to find their limit in the absolute maximum that the class of tenants is physically able to pay. It is those rents that determine house prices more broadly, because home buyers are competing with landlords, whether actual landlords or potential landlords. So all house prices are determined by the rent that could be payable on that property. Whether that changes if you boost supply is a theoretical question, but there are some good clues. If we look at the kind of the developers' paradises, places like Liverpool, places like Manchester, places where there genuinely are vast amounts of housing, we do see a deepening housing crisis. We don't see landlords fighting over tenants and lowering rents. In fact, we see the opposite. We see large build-to-rent corporate landlords demanding and achieving monopoly prices and driving up home prices across those cities more generally. If you don't forbid landlords from demanding as much as they want for them, you'd have a system in which people would buy property, empty homes, second homes, third homes, Airbnbs, holiday lets, and landlords are still screwing over tenants because the law allows them to. The property development types have been very, very good at selling this narrative that we just need to build more homes and that will solve everything. I mean, if you wander around any city, you are surrounded by brand new housing. There's so much housing. There's easily enough to meet social needs in a relatively generous way. I think we need to start standing up to a discourse around shortage, and at the very least making the developers prove it before we start agreeing with them. It seems to just be an article of faith. It seems to just be that if you are, for example, a Labour councillor who has a prosperous career ahead of them in planning consultancy and property development, you delude yourself into thinking that you're doing a good thing because there's a housing shortage and getting more houses built is the solution. I think it's time we put a stop to that sort of argument and think differently about how we combat the housing crisis through economic warfare on landlords, through regulation, through making it unprofitable, through rent control, through increasing the number of buyers, increasing the capacity for social housing to grow, rather than just saying, build more housing at all costs. The book opens with an anecdote about a member of Housing Action in Southern Lambeth during the pandemic who was living in standard private rented accommodation, and the government increased the housing benefit allowance during the pandemic as a measure to prevent homelessness. The landlord immediately decided to renew the tenancy at a higher rent because the state was offering more free money and the landlord wanted it. So that's how the housing crisis works. Without any form of security and without any form of rent control, even measures that are designed to alleviate poverty simply serve to convert state spending into landlords' wealth. They produce an immediately higher income for the landlord, but they also make the property itself more valuable because any other landlord who wanted to buy it would be receiving a higher rent. So unless you really grab landlordism by the throat in legal and economic terms, anything you do just makes things worse, or at least fails to make things better. There's an amazing capacity for things to get worse. I think all of us would be surprised at what we've come to accept if we were told this 20 years ago. If we were told that all of our friends, or if, when my generation was at school, if we were told that everyone would be living in shared houses deep into their 30s in terrible, terrible conditions, on insecure contracts, we would have said, no, that can't be allowed to happen. And yet we've just accepted it. We know that there are worse places in the world, in rich and poor countries alike. We know that by degrees we can come to accept those things. So unless we choose to resolve the housing crisis, we have capacity to assume an enormous amount of misery, and we will, unless we decide to solve it. At the same time, one of the points I'm really keen to make is that landlord abolition is really, really achievable. We've come so close in the past, and all you really need is legal and economic tinkering to create a much, much better system. And partly as revenge for what we've had to put up with so far, but partly just as a kind of better future for the generations that come after us. As a warning to landlords, the value of your investment can go down instead of up. And it's long, long overdue. It's like an earthquake on the San Andreas Fault, and hopefully just as destructive. The government here seems to be very, very reluctant to the idea that landlordism can cease to be profitable. And I think, again, one of the interesting things in the book has been this kind of relearning the old wisdom. I came across a really good quote from the Great Depression where a left-wing MP was saying, well, all of us are being told to tighten our belts. Why do landowners get a free pass on that? Why are they the only ones who are exempt? And I think that's such a valuable idea because we are once again returning to a narrative of austerity, returning to a narrative of the credit card being maxed out. Local authorities like Birmingham are being allowed to fail with all of their arts funding being cut, all of their culture being cut, all of the necessary important things having to suffer. And the one thing that cannot be allowed to suffer is the idea that you make profit from land. The amount of wealth created from housing over the course of my lifetime is unimaginable. The question then becomes what happens to all of that wealth as the generation of baby boomers starts to pass it on. I guess the question that millennials face as they inherit this is, do they want a system in which they benefit from ill-gotten gains? Do they want a system in which they are the direct beneficiaries of the generation of renters paying half of their wages over and over again every month to this generation of wealthy baby boomers? Do they think it's fair and just that they should participate in a society in which they get effortlessly wealthy from the amount of suffering that's been caused by previous generations of renters having to cough up all that money every month?